Welcome. This training is California Department of Education Required Corrective Actions for the Vallejo City Unified School District Special Education Department. This training will cover all of the required corrective actions issued by the California Department of Education from Vallejo City Unified School District Special Education Department's comprehensive review. At the end of this PowerPoint presentation, specific Code of Federal Regulations for students' non-compliant items are also addressed as well. Child fine procedures. The district is required to locate and identify all students birth through ages 21 who may be in need of special education and related services. The district also has an interagency agreement with the regional center that is compliant with state and federal law regarding services to infants, toddlers, and their families. Parents' participation. The district must provide training to staff and administrators on the provision of written notice to parents, on the IEP team's consideration of parent concerns for enhancing the education of the student, on ensuring that 3-year evaluations include a review of information provided by the parent, on placement decisions made by a team that includes the parents, and on providing parents with a copy of the evaluation report and documentation of the eligibility determination. Meeting notices. The district must provide training for staff and administrators on notifying parents about their child's IEP, on ensuring parent participation in IEP meetings through consistent attempts to arrange for a mutually agreed upon time and place, on notifying parents early enough to ensure that they have an opportunity to attend and schedule the IEP meeting at a mutually agreed upon time and place. And lastly, on notifying parents about their child's IEP meeting that includes the purpose, the time, and location of the meeting, and who will be in attendance. Procedural safeguards and prior written notice. The district must provide training for staff and administrators on written notice to parents when their child is being considered for a special education referral, and ensuring parents understand proceedings at the IEP meeting, for example, the procedural safeguard rights, and then on the provision of prior written notice to parents. For example, prior written notice is utilized when there's a significant program change of placement. For example, regular education to special education, or leaving special education and going back into regular education. As well as a prior written notice can also be used for a proposal to initiate a change, or if the district refuses a parent's request, we can do a refusal through a prior written notice as well. Credentialed staff and IEP member excusal. The district must provide training for staff and administrators on providing services for appropriately credentialed or qualified staff, on utilizing required members of the IEP team and other qualified professionals as appropriate to review evaluation data and input from the student's parents, and identifying what additional data, if any, are needed to determine whether the student continues to have a disability. And lastly, on the district's policies and procedures related to excusing an individual education program team member from the IEP team, and which is simply filling out the excusal form on SACE. Timelines. The district must provide training for staff and administrators on providing the parent with an evaluation plan within 15 days of the referral for evaluation that contains all of the required contents, on timelines for annual review, which happens annually every year, on preparing and conducting 3-year triennial evaluations and any subsequent IEP meetings, also on the contents, process, and participants for developing IEPs, which again includes initial IEPs, annual IEPs, and triennial IEPs. Timelines in regards to completing an IEP within 60 days of obtaining a written parental consent to an evaluation plan. And lastly, on the review of the IEP. Assessments. The district must provide training for staff and administrators on completing assessments before the development of the initial IEP or triennial IEP, on conducting a full and individual initial evaluation prior to the provision of special education and related services, on using comprehensive assessments that were administered in all areas of suspected disability by trained and knowledgeable personnel, using sound instruments, as well as using a multidisciplinary team to conduct evaluations. Providing training also on the IEP team's consideration on the academic, developmental, and functional needs of the child. And lastly, on the IEP team's consideration of the results of evaluations and assessments. Assessment in regards to multiple measures. The district must provide training for staff and administrators on the IEP team responsibilities to draw upon a variety of sources of information such as tests, teacher recommendations, parent input, when making the determination of eligibility. Also, a review of existing evaluation information, including information provided by parents, current classroom-based assessments and observations by the teachers and related service providers. And also ensuring a variety of tools and strategies are used to gather functional, developmental, and academic information to determine appropriate educational programs. Alternative assessment, the reliability and validity of these types of assessments. The district must provide training for staff and administrators on ensuring that IQ tests are not administered to African American students, and also on the use of technically sound instruments that may assess the relative contribution of cognitive and behavioral factors in addition to physical or developmental factors. Additional assessment components. The district must provide training for staff and administrators on the IEP team's responsibilities to review assessment results, determine eligibility, determine the content of the IEP, consider local transportation policies and criteria, and make program placement recommendations. Also, including a statement regarding participation in district or statewide achievement tests, and an explanation of why participation is not appropriate for the child if the IEP team makes that decision. Written evaluation reports, including all the required contents, and lastly, on the determination of placements. Health. Looking at the health and nursing needs of our students. The district must provide training for staff and administrators on conducting vision and hearing screenings, on how the LEA must solicit health information from the primary physician as a part of the assessment, including whether the condition affects strength, vitality, or alertness, and the health care services required. On how when a student with a diagnosed health condition, the IEP team must determine that a student qualifies as an individual exceptional needs in the area of other health impairment, when the student has limited strength, vitality, or alertness due to chronic or acute health problems, and which adversely affects educational performance. Also, ensuring that assessments include health information and incorporate current treatment plans from the child's treating physician for health care services during school hours. And lastly, training on policies and procedures specifying that the IEP must include a description of the specialized physical health care services provided during extracurricular activities, including field trips and other school-sponsored activities. English language learners. The district must provide training for staff and administrators on providing written notice in the native language of the family or other mode of communication used by the parent. On the identification, evaluation, and development of IEPs for children who are English language learners. Ensuring that the IEP of children identified as English learners includes instructional systems which meet the language developmental needs of the students and access to the general education curriculum. And lastly, on district policies and procedures, ensuring that the IEP of children identified as English learners includes activities which lead to the development of their English language proficiency. California English Language Development Test, the CELT. So the district must provide training for staff and administrators on assessing a student with limited English proficiency to ensure that they measure the extent to which a child has a disability and a need for special education, rather than measuring the child's English proficiency. Policies and procedures regarding the annual assessment of English learners using the CELT or an alternate to determine English language proficiency. District policies and procedures related to IEP team determination that the California English Language Development Test, CELT, will be administered with or without modifications or accommodations, or whether English proficiency will be measured using an alternate assessment for children identified as English learners. And lastly, on district policies and procedures, ensuring that the results of the California English Language Development Test are considered when developing the IEP for children identified as English learners. IEP goals. The district must provide training for staff and administrators on ensuring a direct relationship between the present levels of performance, goals, and objectives and the specific educational services to be provided, including measurable annual goals, including academic and functional goals resulting from the disability that will enable involvement in and progress in the general education curriculum. On statements on the IEP that constitute a description of how the student's progress toward meeting the annual goals described will be measured, a description of periodic reports on the progress the student is making towards those annual goals, with the issuance that report cards will be provided, a statement on how students' parents will be regularly informed by such means as periodic report cards, at least as often as parents of non-disabled students, regarding progress towards annual goals, a statement of the extent to which progress will enable the child to achieve the annual goals by the year's end. And lastly, a review of the IEP, including review of progress towards previous annual goals, progress in the general curriculum, and or benchmarks for students eligible for statewide testing using the CAPA. Transition. District must provide training for staff and administrators on the transition needs of students, including transition services that focus on improving academic and functional achievement of the student to facilitate their movement from school to post-secondary school. On including measurable post-secondary goals in the IEP based on age-appropriate transition assessments related to training, education, employment, and where appropriate, independent living skills. On the transition needs of students, including that the IEP contains transition services that are based on the individual student's needs, taking into account the student's own preferences and interests. And lastly, on the transition needs of students, including that the IEP contains a statement of the needed transition services in all required areas as follows: instruction, related services, community experiences, the development of employment, and other post-school objectives, and when appropriate, acquisition of daily living skills and functional vocational evaluation. Transition. The needs of students, including an invitation of the student to actually attend the IEP team meeting, when the purpose includes the consideration of transition goals and services. On the provision of prior written notice to ensure that a student age 16 or younger, if appropriate, The notice of an IEP meeting to discuss transition services identifies and invites any other agency that may have the responsibility for payment of provision of transition services for them to send a representative to that meeting. On the transition needs of students, including that a representative of any agency that is likely to be responsible for providing or paying for transition services is invited to that IEP team meeting. And lastly, including the IEP team will be reconvened to identify alternative strategies to meet the transition objectives when a participating agency other than the LEA failed to provide the transition services in the IEP. Course of study, age of majority, and graduation. The district must provide training for staff and administrators on the needs of students, including the documentation of course of study in the student's IEP. On including for pupils in grades 7 through 12, any alternative means and modes necessary for the pupil to complete the district's prescribed course of study and to meet or exceed proficiency standards for graduation. On providing students and their parents with written notice that all rights under Part B of IDEA transfer to the student upon reaching 18 years of age. On the student's policies and procedures related to the transition needs of students, including the parent of the student who has attained the age of majority is provided with prior written notice of graduation from high school with a regular high school diploma. And lastly, on the district's policy procedures related to providing the student whose eligibility was terminated due to graduation from secondary school with a regular diploma or due to exceeding the age eligibility for FAPE with a summary of academic achievement and functional performance, which includes recommendations on how to assist the student in meeting post-secondary goals. Discipline. The district must provide training for staff and administrators on behavior intervention plans. On the participation of general education teachers in the IEP meeting to assist with the decision-making process about the appropriate positive behavior interventions and supports and other strategies for student, and supplementary aids and services, as well as program modifications and supports from school personnel. On the provision of a free appropriate public education when a student is involved in disciplinary actions involving suspension and expulsion. And lastly, on ensuring parent participation in IEP meetings to consider expulsion. Related services and extended school year. The district must provide training for staff and administrators on including a statement on the IEP of the special education and related services and supplementary aids and services to be provided to the child or on behalf of the child. And again, the provision of special education and related services according to the IEP. And lastly, on the IEP, including extended school year services. Least restrictive environment. The district must provide training for staff and administrators on ensuring that children with disabilities are educated with children who are non-disabled. On ensuring that students with disabilities participate in academic and non-academic and extracurricular services and activities to promote maximum interaction with the general school population. And lastly, on ensuring that the child participates with non-disabled children in non-academic and extracurricular services and activities to the maximum extent appropriate to the needs of that child. General education program. The district must provide training for staff and administrators on assessing the requirements that written assessment reports must include information related to enabling the student to be involved in and progress in the general curriculum, or for preschool students to participate in appropriate activities as well. On including a statement of the child's present levels of performance on the IEP and how the disability affects the child's involvement and progress in the general curriculum. On the participation of general education teachers in the IEP meeting. And lastly, on including an explanation on the IEP of the extent, if any, to which the student will not participate with general education students in the general education classroom and in extracurricular and non-academic activities. Accommodations and modifications. The district must provide training for staff and administrators on the provision of program modifications and supports from school personnel. Also, the district's policies and procedures specifying that each teacher and provider is informed of the specific responsibilities related to implementing the IEP and the specific accommodations, program modifications, and supports from school personnel for that student. Code Federal Regulations. Education Code Section 56343.5 states a meeting of an IEP team requested by a parent to review an IEP shall be held within 30 days, not counting days between the pupil's regular school sessions, terms, or days of school vacation in excess of 5 school days from the date of receipt from the parent's written request. Also, if a parent makes an oral request, the local educational agency shall notify the parent of the need for a written request and the procedure for filing a written request to request an IEP. Education Code Section 56043I requires a pupil's individualized education program shall be implemented as soon as possible following the individualized education program team meeting. And Education Code Section 56341B, the IEP team shall include all of the following: not less than 1 special education teacher of the pupil, or if appropriate, not less than 1 special education provider of the pupil. 34 Code Federal Regulation Section 300.303B requires a reevaluation conducted must occur at least once every 3 years, unless the parent and the public agency agree that a reevaluation is unnecessary. Education Code 56344A, an IEP required as a result of an assessment of a pupil shall be developed within a total time not to exceed 60 days, again, not counting days between pupils' regular school sessions, terms, or days of school vacation in excess of 5 school days from the date of receipt of the parent's written request for assessment, unless the parent agrees in writing to an extension. Education Code Section 56345A2 requires the IEP is a written statement for each individual with exceptional needs that is developed, reviewed, and revised in accordance with this section, and that includes the following: a statement of measurable annual goals, including academic and functional goals, designed to do the following: A, meet the needs of the individual that result from the disability of the individual to enable that pupil to be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum, and B, to meet each of the other educational needs of the pupil that result from the disability of the individual. And lastly, Code Federal Regulation Section 300.322F requires the public agency must give the parent a copy of the child's IEP at no cost to the parent. Thank you for your attention during this training. For further supports, we have our director, George Anich, our assistant director, Shelly Iguera, elementary program specialist, Rachel Chang, middle school program specialist, Roberta Ordaway, and high school program specialist, Michael Alom. Thank you again for your attention during this training, and we hope it has provided additional knowledge, and we will also be sending more information to come in the near future. Thank you and have a great day.